Look at this. Look at this. Somebody come and look at this.
So I have been thinking
Look
a
at
lot
this.
about something that has come up recently, related to the movie Moana 2. But I think it sparked some really important conversation around identity, culture, what it means to be Black. Specifically, right, there was a scene that introduced people who appeared to be Black, and they represent the Melanesian people of the region. And so those people, the Melanesians, they're genetically distinct from people of African descent. And so social media, namely TikTok, there seems to now be a debate between Melanesians and Black Americans. And what I'm noticing is just that there's really just a huge disconnect, I think, between the two groups, and that misunderstanding is significant. And so my point, though, here today really isn't much about Moana or the Melanesians themselves, but rather about how we define Blackness and what it really means for us in America and in the Americas, period, right? Physically, Melanesians may resemble many people of African descent, but genetically and culturally and spiritually, they have very different backgrounds, right? And so there was, and I actually think this is cool, it's the nerd in me, there was an independent evolution of Blackness in the Pacific, separate from what happened in Africa. And I think it's fascinating. Yet, I wonder how much of our lived experiences are actually, different. Like, is there much of a difference in our lived realities? I wonder. But from what I could tell, the core of the debate seems to be about who gets to define Blackness, what it really means. Is someone only considered Black if they descend from Africa? It's a complicated question, and I really think one tied to the identity of so many different people. And we all internally, I think, define it differently. So it's a conversation definitely worth exploring, and one that I personally find pretty interesting. Um, but, in the age of the internet, I think we're learning a lot more about each other, certainly more than ever before. But to give you some context, and this is really for people who aren't American, certainly not in the Atlantic, like definitely that group of people, and more so, and maybe just a refresher, just a reminder for those of us that are American. But I think it's important to really emphasize that Black people in America are not a monolith. Like, we are not all the same. We don't like the same music. We don't eat the same foods. We don't even all hang out with each other. We don't have the same religion. We have a variety of skin colors and tones, hair textures and eye colors. And so I think I just want to emphasize that we are very different people, like within this collective group that has long been stereotyped, right? And then on top of that, the United States is a massive, massive place. So I think to better help emphasize how different we all are. We have 50 states, and the culture can vary so much depending on regionally where you're from. Growing up in New York, which is the Northeast, is so different than growing up in Georgia, which is in the Southeast. That's different than California, which is on our West Coast. And that experience is different than if you grew up in the Midwest in a state like Missouri, or Illinois. And to give further context, from Georgia to California is over 2,100 miles, which is roughly like around 3,500 kilometers. So it's a big place, and you can be American and grow up and have very, very different experiences. And I think to complicate like this conversation even further, Black people in the United States, like, we aren't isolated. We're part of a larger global diaspora that stretches, right? First of all, we have our Canadians to the north, and they have Black people. But really, it's part of this larger global diaspora that stretches across the Caribbean and Latin American region, South America. And these countries were themselves colonized by different groups of people. So they were colonized by the French and the Spanish and the British and Dutch. And so, how they even define Blackness vary substantially from how we do it in America. It's always confusion and amongst each other, right? So this concept, I think, of Blackness is really, truly an intriguing one. And so the conversation of who owns the term, especially from the perspective of Black Americans, it's complicated. In the last century alone, right, the title for someone who looked like me, who was me in the United States, might have changed from, there's certainly the N word with the hard R at the end, colored, Negro. There are people who I know who have that on their birth certificate, African American, Afro American, Black. So please understand that, even how we're identifying ourselves, there's been some psychological chess moves within while we have been uh, in the United States. So I think just to emphasize, right, people of African descent, they were stolen from their homelands, their cultures, their identities were stripped away. We've lost so much of who we were, the languages, the music, the stories, the tradition, and that's not by accident. These are intentional efforts to disconnect us from our roots and break us down, right? So whether it's South Carolina in the United States, in the southern part of the United States, or Guyana, South America, descendants of enslaved Africans do share this collective trauma, which is this history of being mistreated, exploited. And I think that's important to remember because I believe it shapes how we talk about Blackness, which leads me to my next point, that I actually believe Blackness is an experience. It's how you believe or what you believe in your mind. It's how you perceive that the world is treating you. It is the reality of how the world treats people like you. And so, in many ways, I do think that's what it is. And I've had to tell people, right? Folks have told me, well, it's not my fault. Black Americans don't know who they are or where they come from. And, I get that. But at the same time, it's not our fault either. And I think I want to make that clear. It was about erasure. It was about cutting us off from the things that made us who we were, the things that would have helped us stay whole. And every time we take a step toward figuring out how to become just a little bit whole, it blows up in some way, right? And while many of us can trace our roots back to West Africa somewhere, even then, we come from so many diverse tribes of people in the region. We come from different countries within that region. These different countries and their different tribes, they speak different languages and they had their different beliefs and they had their different practices. So even when people say, go back to Africa to figure out where you're from, where exactly is it that we're going? Again, with all that said, when you know better, do better. And so it is definitely on us now that resources exist and it's accessible to just take some time and learn, just learn a little bit about what some of the real stories are. Um, yeah, so I think I'm just helping to make clear why it might be so hard for some people to wrap their heads around this idea that people who look like us could evolve. In other parts of the world independently with their own cultures. I think to our Melanesian brothers and sisters, you may have many people have learned about us. And God only knows what you've learned about us, but we certainly have not learned about others in the same way. And we were intentionally kept from learning about ourselves. And I think that is the reality of the system that we're all living in right now. I'd actually be really interested to hear about how others perceive the Black American culture. It's likely through music and movies, but I'd still be really really cool to hear what other perspectives are on that. Either way, these virtual spaces, I think, allow us to have these conversations, healthy debate without division. And I really do believe that more can be gained by figuring out how what we have in common and how to come together. And after all, and this is people, I think maybe specific to the African diaspora, no matter where you are, we do share a history of survival. We've had to navigate systems that try to erase us, erase who we are, to exploit our talents while wiping away our cultures. And yet, here we are. And I'm definitely not an expert on the different cultures, certainly not within the Pacific or even the Caribbean or Africa. But I think that's the point. The point is that, I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to have these conversations. I want to engage and really take the time to understand. And I encourage you all, I encourage everyone to just take the time to understand where we come from and how our histories are intertwined. And maybe, just maybe if we come together, we might be able to carve out, a place for ourselves instead of groveling for a seat at the table, right? Maybe we build our own table. But I think that's it. I'd just like to thank you for listening. Have a good one. Take care.